When hunger struck during the Great Depression, people ate whatever they could get their hands on, and I mean anything. From creamed brains on toast to boiled sheep's heads, these shocking and stomach-turning meals were born out of necessity. These are dishes from that desperate era that thankfully disappeared from our tables. Who needs deli meat when you've got potato peels? During the Great Depression, even scraps were too valuable to waste, and that was the sentiment. Potato peel sandwiches were the epitome of making do and turned what most of us would toss into a surprisingly hearty meal. Stuffed between slices of bread, and if you were lucky, slathered with a bit of butter or lard, the peels were cleaned and fried in whatever grease was available. It's kind of like a rustic early version of a loaded potato skin sandwich. The crispy, slightly salty peels added a nice texture to otherwise plain bread. Sometimes onions or garlic would be thrown in for added flavor. And if you had cheese, jackpot. This humble meal was filling and resourceful and showed you didn't have to spend much to make something comforting. Potato peel sandwiches might seem like a relic of the past, but they've quietly influenced modern cooking trends. Today, zero-waste recipes and root-to-stem cooking draw inspiration from the same resourceful spirit. Chefs now celebrate potato peels as the star of gourmet dishes, seasoning them with truffle oil or pairing them with artisanal bread. The humble sandwich, once a survival tactic, has found new life as a talking point in sustainability circles. It's fascinating how something born out of necessity can inspire culinary innovation decades later. Maybe it's time to bring them back, not out of desperation, but out of respect for their history. Potted meat spread. The 1930s tin can be savior. You're absolutely right if you're imagining mystery meat mashed into a paste. However, let's face it, that little tin of potted meat was the hero of many Depression-era meals. This questionable concoction was spread on crackers or smeared between slices of stale bread and kept families fed when other protein sources were out of reach. Potted meat spread was made from finely ground scraps of pork or beef, seasoned with salt, spices, and sometimes gelatin, and had a long shelf life and a low price tag. Others got creative, adding it to onions or pickles to add some flavor. Some were not so lucky and ate it straight from the can. And let's not forget the genius marketing. Even if potted meat wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, it was often marketed as the ultimate protein-packed snack for families on the go. During a time when home-cooked meals were often replaced by anything that could be prepared quickly, it was cheap, filling, and in its own way, a miracle worker. Was it delicious? Probably not. It was practical, portable, and didn't need cooking. A major bonus when every penny counted. Potted meat spread still lives on in grocery aisles as a throwback to those hard times. You won't see it on the center of a modern charcuterie board, but it's a reminder of survival, ingenuity, and the pure will to make something edible out of almost nothing. Sometimes dinner was just onions, water, and a dream. Depression-era classic born of pure necessity, onion gravy on bread. Onions were the next best thing to flavor whatever scraps you had, or didn't have, when meat was scarce. The result? A simple, savory meal that was surprisingly satisfying, given its humble beginnings. Frying onions in a bit of lard or butter, if you were lucky, then simmering them in water and thickening the mixture with flour was the way the gravy was made. Voila! Pour this over a slice of bread, and dinner was served. Interestingly, onion gravy on bread became such a staple that it wasn't just limited to supper. It sometimes served as a breakfast or lunch, depending on what was available. The beauty of the dish was its ability to stretch the little food that people had into a comforting meal. And while the dish might not have earned high culinary acclaim back in the day, it was a true testament to the resourcefulness and resilience of families during the Great Depression. Even if the bread was stale, the gravy would soften it right up. It wasn't just about feeding an entire family, it was about stretching a single onion. Today, we may not think onion gravy on bread is much of a culinary wonder, but back then it was a lifeline. There's something charmingly rustic about the dish, believe it or not, and it's even made its way into the gourmet circles under fancier names like onion tartines. It wasn't a foodie trend for those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a tribute to creativity in the face of hardship. Is this the most metal dinner of the Great Depression? Boiled sheep's head, a meal so intense it had its own built-in stare-down. Folks did indeed boil an entire sheep's head. And no, this is not just urban legend. The head was thoroughly cleaned, seasoned, and simmered for hours until tender. The result? A dish rich in fat, where no part of the animal was wasted. The broth, cheeks, tongue, and eyeballs were all considered delicacies. Good liquid gold for soups or stews. Why eat sheep's head? When money was tight, every scrap of protein was important, and the head had a surprising amount of meat. The families gathered around the table, picking it clean and making the best of what they had. Boiled sheep's head might sound horrifying to modern sensibilities, but for those who could turn something unappealing into a meal worth savoring, it was a source of pride. It was also a lesson in sustainability long before sustainability became a trendy thing. These days, it's a rare dish, but in some cultures, it's a culinary tradition that lives on. If the idea of cow brain stew makes you squirm, just think about eating it because you had no other choice. Even during the Great Depression, even cow brains were fair game in the fight against hunger. Surprisingly, they weren't just edible. In some circles, they were considered a delicacy. The process of making cow brain stew was meticulous. Brains had to be carefully cleaned to remove any membranes and then gently cooked to avoid an overly rubbery texture. Once seasoned and simmered, the resulting stew had a smooth, creamy consistency that was somewhat comforting. It was silky, almost custard-like, and possibly that's why some people actually liked it. The brain was usually served over rice or potatoes and made one brain into a meal for a family. Cow brain was nutritionally a powerhouse of protein and vitamins and was a valuable food source in lean times. The idea of eating brains didn't exactly have much popularity, and as soon as more appealing options were offered, cow brain stew fell out of favor. Interestingly, in some cultures, eating brain meat was considered a delicacy long before the Depression. For example, certain European and Asian dishes have celebrated cow brains as a prized food item. But as food options became more plentiful and tastes evolved, cow brain stew faded into the background, becoming a curious relic of a time when necessity ruled the dinner plate. These days, cow brain stew is more likely to be a dare than a dinner table. Back then, it was a lifesaver, proving that humans can eat anything, even when the going gets tough. Creamed brains on toast is the meal that makes squeamish eaters bolt from the table if there ever was one. During the Great Depression, resourcefulness was king, and nothing went to waste, not even a part of the animal. While many struggling families would eat brains, they were a delicacy. Don't be fooled by the word delicacy. This dish was born out of necessity, not gourmet aspirations. Making it was straightforward. Brains were boiled or sautéed with onions, milk, and a pinch of seasoning, cow or pig being the usual suspects. The mixture thickened to a creamy consistency and was ladled over toasted bread, often the stale kind, because, waste not, want not. It looked like a bizarre version of gravy toast, but it was Instagram-worthy, and it did fill bellies when there were few other options. Brains were rich and almost buttery, but convincing anyone to dig in was another matter entirely. Kids were probably bribed with the promise of dessert if they cleaned their plates even then. Creamed brains on toast is a long-gone American culinary staple today, existing only in the fringes of foodie culture or as a trivia question about survival food. This dish is the love it or leave it symbol of grit and ingenuity. Prune pudding is evidence that even in hard times, people still wanted a sweet ending to their meal. Fresh fruit was rare during the Great Depression, and prunes, with their long shelf life and natural sweetness, were the unsung heroes of dessert. They weren't glamorous, but they did the job. This was a humble pudding, stewed down to a thick, syrupy base. Prunes were often sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg to improve the flavor. A few cooks even added milk, breadcrumbs, or a touch of lemon juice to brighten the dish. But if you were lucky, it might be topped with a dollop of whipped cream. But that was a luxury. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Prune pudding was surprisingly nutritionally rich for its simplicity. It wasn't just a treat, it was practical sustenance packed with fiber and vitamins. But its reputation as a digestive aid made it a divisive dessert. It wasn't everyone's idea of a sweet indulgence, to put it mildly. Prune pudding has faded into the background today, often overshadowed by more flashy desserts. In a world fixated on superfoods and functional eating, maybe it's time for this Depression-era favorite to come back. But don't expect it to replace chocolate cake anytime soon. What if you opened a can and slid out an entire chicken, gelatinous and glistening in all its preserved glory? Isn't that the stuff of a culinary horror story? But the canned whole chicken was a practical miracle for struggling depression families. It was exactly what it sounded like, an oddity. A fully cooked chicken stuffed into a tin, bones and all, sitting in a salty broth that turned to gelatin when chilled. No one could afford to be picky in the 1930s, but the sight of it wobbling onto a plate might have been enough to make someone lose their appetite. The process of making canned whole chicken was fascinating. First, the chicken would be fully cooked and then packed into a tin with broth. After the can was sealed, the gelatin formed as the contents cooled, helping to preserve the meat and provide a long shelf life. While it didn't have the tender, fresh flavor of a roast chicken, it was a surprisingly adaptable ingredient. Heated whole or shredded into soups, casseroles, or sandwiches, the chicken was a versatile, cost-effective protein source. Taste-wise, it wasn't winning any Michelin stars, but it did what it needed to do: keep families fed. It wasn't fresh, but the salty flavor covered that up, and when combined with gravy or spices, it was surprisingly tasty. Canned chicken still exists, but the whole chicken in a can is a thing of the past. It's a sign of how far food preservation has come and a reminder of what desperate times can do. The canned whole chicken is gone, but those who lived through its heyday have not forgotten it. Culinary creativity and gelatin met, and not always in a good way, in aspic salads. Imagine a jello mold of vegetables, meat, or eggs squirming to the dinner table. But if that doesn't sound appetizing, you're not alone. These savory gelatin dishes were a common way to stretch ingredients during the Great Depression. Affordable and easy to prepare, gelatin was made from boiled animal bones. Families would toss in whatever scraps were available: cooked chicken, canned peas, shredded carrots, hard-boiled eggs, often flavored with broth or tomato juice to create a savory base. It turned out to be a strange mixture that looked like dessert, but tasted like a casserole. Some loved them because aspics were practical, and others hated them because they were so textural. It was filling, but not appetizing, the sight of meat suspended in a quivering jelly. Sunday suppers often featured these salads, served with crackers or bread to make the meal even heartier. Aspic salads are a punchline today, not a recipe, but they are a symbol of a generation that found a way to make do with what it had. They're a wobbly slice of history. Love them or hate them. Surprise spice cake is a prime example of how Depression-era cooks knew how to turn a lack of ingredients into a culinary triumph. No eggs, butter, or milk? No problem. This cake was made with pantry staples and a little ingenuity, and turned out moist, flavorful, and most importantly, budget-friendly. Often the surprise was in its unexpected ingredients. Some of the versions used mayonnaise in place of eggs and oil, vinegar, or even tomato soup to add moisture. The warm spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, did double duty to cover odd flavors and provide the cake with its signature aroma. If they had raisins, nuts, or applesauce on hand, they threw those in, and each version was different. The surprise spice cake was a hit at potlucks and family gatherings because it didn't taste like a compromise. It was rich and comforting and proof that you didn't have to use fancy ingredients to make something special. This cake has fallen out of favor, but some of its descendants, like mayonnaise cake, still turn up in recipe books. It's a sweet reminder that even in the toughest of times, people find ways to treat themselves and one another. The best desserts sometimes come from thinking outside the box, or in this case, the pantry. Lamb's lung and lights may not have been the best thing to don't knock it till you try it, but it was a Depression-era staple nonetheless. The lungs, heart, and liver of a lamb, or in other words, everything the butcher left behind after he took the prime cuts. During hard times, nothing went to waste, not even the parts of the animal most people wouldn't dream of eating today. Boiled and sliced, lamb's lung and lights were sometimes prepared for a hearty stew or fried with onions and spices to hide the gamey flavor. It was nutritionally dense, with iron, protein, and essential vitamins in abundance. The downside? Cooking with the smell was an acquired experience, to put it mildly. This dish had an unappealing reputation, but it was versatile. With potatoes or bread, the organs could stretch to feed large families. It was an act of culinary ingenuity, and while it might sound like something straight out of a horror movie to modern palates, it was an act of culinary ingenuity. Lamb's lung and lights have vanished from most dinner tables, but if you're curious, you might still see it on some adventurous menus or in a distant family recipe book, written in faded ink and a generous dose of nostalgia. That's right, boiled cow udder. You're either a Depression-era cook or incredibly brave if you've ever looked at a cow and wondered, I wonder what that part tastes like. Waste not, want not was embodied in cow udder, which would turn a regularly discarded part into a meal that fed hungry families. Preparation was simple but labor-intensive. But the udder had to be thoroughly cleaned, for obvious reasons, and then boiled for hours to soften its tough texture. It was cooked and sliced and served plain or fried for a little extra flavor. They'd smother it with gravy or toss it into a stew with vegetables if someone was feeling fancy. The flavor? It's mild and slightly sweet, but most people would say it's interesting. Ironically, cow udder was nutritionally a decent source of protein and calcium, but its usual role was in milk production. It's not a dish you'll see on modern menus, but its existence reminds us that a generation was resourceful enough to make do with what they had. Boiled cow udder might not have been a crowd favorite, but for families with empty plates, it was better than nothing, and for that, it should get a tip of the hat, or a cringe. During the Great Depression, if butter was gold, then lard was its more affordable cousin, spreadable, calorie-dense, and heart-stoppingly rich. When there was nothing else to slap between two slices of bread, lard sandwiches were a go-to meal. It was as simple as it sounds. Rendered pork fat smeared on bread, sometimes with salt or sugar depending on how you were feeling. It was all about energy. In the days when manual labor was the norm, people needed cheap, high-calorie food to get through the day. Lard provided that in spades. The greasy fare wasn't always kid-friendly, but kids ate it anyway because hunger wasn't picky. Some creative cooks jazzed it up with a drizzle of molasses or with a few slices of leftover onion. It wasn't gourmet, but it was good enough. Peanut butter or more sophisticated spreads have since replaced lard sandwiches, but they are a reminder of how families got by with nothing but ingenuity and a can of fat. When life gave them lemons, or didn't, Depression-era cooks made vinegar pie. It was this frugal dessert that was a clever stand-in for lemon pie when citrus was a luxury most could not afford. They made a tart filling that was surprisingly good for the flavor of lemons by combining vinegar, sugar, water, and a little bit of flour. Vinegar pie was magic because it was so simple. It was poured into a flaky crust, baked to perfection, and often topped with a sprinkle of sugar or a thin layer of meringue. The sweetness of the vinegar balanced out the sweetness, and the result was a surprisingly palatable dessert that made the most of pantry staples. The taste was not the only thing about this pie, it was about hope. A sweet treat, no matter how humble, could be a welcome distraction during hard times, a reminder of what it was like to be normal. Sunday suppers or community gatherings often served vinegar pie, whose tangy flavor and curious name were a topic of conversation. Vinegar pie is almost a thing of the past today, but it occasionally shows up in vintage recipe collections or as a curiosity among modern bakers. A reminder that even the barest ingredients can be turned into something worth sharing with a little creativity. The jellied veal ring is one of few dishes that screams Depression-era creativity. Picture this: Veal, vegetables, and seasonings tenderly encased in a shimmering gelatin mold. Food was not the only thing. It was art, or at least that's what homemakers told themselves as they unmolded this culinary oddity onto a serving platter. The process was to simmer veal to make a flavorful broth and then to mix that broth with unflavored gelatin. For texture and color, chopped veggies like carrots and celery were added. The mold had the look of a 50s dinner party, but without the glamour and with more desperation. It may sound like a hard sell today, but the jellied veal ring was a hit for several reasons. It stretched meat to feed a crowd, could be served cold, which was a form of saving fuel for cooking, and looked impressive on a table. This dish was able to do both in an era when presentation was often a secondary consideration to practicality. Meat in gelatin might sound strange to modern diners, but to depression sufferers, it was a sign of resourcefulness. The jellied veal ring may be gone, but it is a tantalizing peek into how families got by with what they had, one quivering slice at a time. So how do you take something as unappetizing as a cow's foot and turn it into dessert? Ask a Great Depression cook. Calf's foot jelly was a strange but resourceful way to make a sweet treat with a bit of protein on the side. First, a calf's foot was boiled until the gelatin was released, strained, sweetened, and flavored with citrus or spices. After it cooled, it became wobbly and translucent jelly that could be sliced and served as a dessert or snack. The result was an acquired taste. Sweet, but with a hint of its origins that was a little meaty. It was a jello for poor people and usually served with a dollop of whipped cream to make it pretty. It had a strange profile, but it was a rare indulgence in tough times, and when it was served to guests, it was considered quite fancy. Calf's foot jelly may not be on the dessert table today, but it's a reminder of a generation that used every last scrap. Even if you want to, it's a dish you won't forget. Cracking walnuts was hard enough, but cracking a squirrel's skull for dinner was even harder. During the Great Depression, squirrel brains were not only a source of protein, but in some rural areas, they were a delicacy. These tiny morsels were often fried, scrambled with eggs, cooked into a stew, or any other way to get the nutrients out of them, but it made your stomach turn. Prepping squirrel brains wasn't for the faint of heart. You had to hunt and clean the squirrel, then extract the brains without losing too much to the process. According to them, they had a creamy, almost buttery texture with a flavor that was earthy or gamey. In parts of the country where game was plentiful and other protein sources scarce, squirrel brains became a symbol of survival. This dish is all but extinct today, thankfully, but it's a reminder of just how far people were willing to go to fill their plates during hard times. Fish mold is too much of a good thing. Picture chunks of canned or leftover fish, suspended in gelatin, formed into an eye-catching mold and served cold on a bed of lettuce. This dish sounds like a prank, but it was a Depression-era invention. Fish mold was both a presentation piece and a way to stretch ingredients. To mask the fishy odor, flavored gelatin was combined with mayonnaise, lemon juice, and sometimes even cream cheese. For texture, vegetables such as peas or celery were added. When it was once molded and chilled, it became a central piece to family dinners or potlucks. Why did people eat it? Simply put, gelatin was a trendy ingredient at the time, and it was economical. It was as unappetizing as it sounds, but was considered a fancy dish that added a little flair to an otherwise sparse meal. Fish mold lives on today in vintage cookbooks, accompanied by bemused commentary from modern readers. It's not likely to come back, but it's a quirky culinary relic. Boiled tongue may sound awful, but it was a Depression-era classic that used cheap cuts of meat. Boiled for hours until tender, the tongue was usually beef, sliced and served hot or cold. It had an off-putting origin, but it was surprisingly delicious when prepared well. It was a straightforward cooking process, but very labor-intensive. Onions, garlic, and spices were simmered with the tongue to add flavor. The tough outer layer was peeled away after cooking to reveal a tender, flavorful meat. Boiled tongue was a versatile dish that could be served with mustard, gravy, or sliced thin for sandwiches and fed families cheaply. Tongue is nutritionally rich in protein and iron and is a good meal during lean times. It has a soft texture like roast beef and is mild enough that picky eaters would like it if they didn't ask too many questions about what they were eating. Boiled tongue has fallen out of favor on most dinner tables, but it remains a favorite of adventurous eaters. It's proof that even the most weird cuts of meat can be a winner when prepared properly. If your garden only provided turnips, you learn to love every part of the plant, including the greens. Turnip greens were a Depression staple, prized for their availability and nutritional value. The roots were often roasted or mashed, but the greens were boiled down with water, salt, and sometimes a little bit of bacon fat if you were lucky. Their flavor was strong and earthy, and on their own would have been overwhelming. Cooks often add onions, vinegar, or hot sauce to make them more palatable. They were a filling meal when paired with cornbread or served alongside beans that could stretch for pennies. Turnip greens were packed with vitamins and minerals and were a lifesaver when fresh produce was hard to come by. They were also very resilient, thriving in poor soil and harsh conditions. Turnip greens, though they've fallen out of favor with some, are a beloved side dish in Southern cooking. But during the Depression, they were more than a side. They were survival food. What if dessert was made from water, sugar, flour, butter, and a dash of creativity? Water pie is that Depression-era concoction that somehow took a handful of kitchen scraps and made them into a custard dessert. Water pie was a stroke of genius and a necessity in an era when ingredients were scarce. It was startlingly simple. First, you'd make a basic pie crust. Then you'd layer sugar and flour inside and pour a lot of water over it. I added a few pats of butter on top for flavor and richness, and then popped the whole thing in the oven. The humble ingredients are baked up into a sweet, gelatinous filling. It wasn't gourmet, but it was sweet, filling, and most importantly, cheap. Water pie became a symbol of resilience. This dessert turned a desperate situation into something sweet, and families had to stretch what little they had. For families struggling to get by, it was a small indulgence that provided a moment of joy, even if it wasn't a showstopper at potlucks. Water pie is a quirky reminder today of how people got by with nothing. Modern baking has long since moved on from this minimalist dessert, but it remains in history as a tribute to human ingenuity. Why not use stale bread when it's still good for something? The original upcycled snack was twice-baked bread, a Depression-era staple. Families turned day-old loaves into crispy, versatile treats that could last for weeks, long before croutons and biscotti graced supermarket shelves. It was simple. They were given a light coating of sugar or spices and baked again until rock hard. Some people put a little bit of cinnamon for a dessert twist, while others kept it savory with salt or herbs. The result? A crunchy snack to nibble on a plain Dunkin' coffee or thickened soup. Depression-era resourcefulness was epitomized by twice-baked bread. It used up every crumb and turned a potential loss into a shelf-stable pantry item. This simple dish was a reliable source of calories and flavor in households where waste was not an option. Twice-baked bread has all but disappeared from the culinary landscape, but it's a reminder of the ingenuity of the time. Sure, it's not a match for modern snack foods, but it's a tasty reminder that even stale bread has a second act. Milcorno is a word that sounds like the name of a long-lost breakfast cereal, but it was actually a Depression-era dietary experiment born of necessity. Milcorno was a blend of powdered milk and cornmeal that was designed to be a cheap, protein-rich meal base to keep families from going hungry. Milcorno was promoted by the government as a nutritional powerhouse, able to feed entire households on a shoestring budget. It was, in practice, an acquired taste. It could be cooked into a porridge-like mush, baked into casseroles, or used as a soup thickener. Some added sugar or salt, so it would be more palatable, but most ate it plain, just glad to have something warm and filling. Milcorno was bland, but it did its job. Fresh produce and meat were often out of reach, so they provided essential nutrients. They didn't love it, but they embraced it because it kept them going. Milcorno is now more of a curiosity than a meal option, but it's a fascinating window into the creativity and determination of the time. It may not come back anytime soon, but it's a reminder of how people changed to survive. Yes, it is true. Peanut butter stuffed onions were actually a thing during the Great Depression. It's a weird recipe, but it was born out of sheer necessity. There were plenty of cheap and plentiful onions and peanut butter that provided much-needed protein, so why not combine the two? It was surprisingly easy. Onions were hollowed out, filled with a good dollop of peanut butter, and baked until tender. The onions were softened by the heat, and the peanut butter melted and became nutty. Some recipes suggest sprinkling breadcrumbs on top before baking for a little extra crispiness. The end result was a bizarre but somehow satisfying dish that satisfied bellies without breaking the bank. Gourmet flavor profiles weren't the point. It was about survival. Peanut butter stuffed onions were a strange but nutritious option that families didn't have the luxury of picky eating. This dish is long gone from dinner tables, but it's a reminder of what people used to do with what they had. It's unlikely to make a comeback anytime soon, but it's a quirky reminder that Depression-era cooks were pretty darn ingenious. Peanut butter and mayonnaise sandwiches may sound like a punchline to a bad joke, but they were a real lunch staple during the Great Depression. Back then, combining creamy peanut butter with tangy mayo might seem like a culinary crime, but it was an affordable and surprisingly nutritious meal. It was a simple, versatile sandwich that was loved. Families could whip up a filling meal in seconds with just 2 ingredients. The tanginess of the mayo balanced out the sweetness of the peanut butter, and the combination of the two was actually quite delicious. And dare I say, some people actually liked it. Some added pickles, bananas, or even lettuce for an adventurous twist. This unlikely combo wasn't a fluke, it was a smart way to stretch ingredients and keep bellies full. Peanut butter and mayonnaise were cheap and easy to get, so they were perfect partners in crime. This sandwich is mostly a thing of the past, but it occasionally makes an appearance in nostalgic food circles. It's a quirky relic of an era that was defined by culinary creativity and resilience. Love it or hate it. Maybe someday it'll be trendy again. This has happened before. This simple, affordable dish made its way onto many kitchen tables. Creamed peas on toast. Yuck! Sounds terrible to me, but maybe some of you will disagree. In hard times, this was the go-to meal for families looking for something hearty without draining the pantry. Canned peas, some butter, flour, and milk, and you had yourself a creamy sauce that could turn a humble slice of toast into a meal. I know it doesn't sound glamorous, but creamed peas on toast were the purest form of comfort. You didn't need fancy ingredients or hours of prep time. Toss the peas in a quick white sauce, pour it over toast, and voila, dinner is served. It was filling and warm, with just the right amount of creamines to make you forget that it was actually a can of peas and a piece of toast. Creamed peas on toast came with a great bonus. It was quick to prepare, making it ideal for those nights when you were hungry but didn't have much to work with. It won't win you any culinary awards, but creamed peas on toast was a no-fuss comfort food that got the job done. Vegetable pot pie was proof that you didn't need meat to make a satisfying meal. When times were tough and the meat was either too pricey or just plain unavailable, families turned to the next best thing: vegetables. Awful alternative for all of us who hate veggies, but you had to do what you had to do just to get by. The humble pot pie, traditionally packed with chicken or beef, took a vegetable-only turn during the Great Depression. It consisted of hearty vegetables like potatoes, carrots, peas, and some onions. Vegetable pot pie was a filling, flavorful dish that still gave you that comforting feeling of a homemade meal. And nobody here can even imagine what that must have felt like. When all you ate were just scraps of whatever you could find, getting a vegetable pot pie must have felt like getting a roasted steak. Plus, it was a great way to use up whatever was in the garden or on sale at the market. No meat? No problem. Those veggies could stand their ground. Cooking a vegetable pot pie wasn't only about stretching the budget, it was also about creativity. You could throw in whatever comes to mind and call it dinner. If you, by some miraculous chance, got any canned tuna, that would go in there also. And let's be honest, upon cracking open that golden crust, it didn't matter what lay inside. It only mattered that you had food on the table. Artichokes were in the same vein of ingredients that asparaguses were, because they were also really seasonal ones that you could only get in California. At least the best quality ones only came out of there. That meant other states in America were usually importing artichokes from there, so a bunch of artichokes in California might run you 10 to 20 cents. But in other states, it may cost twice that to cover up the costs of importing. It was also one of those ingredients you needed skilled labor for, because you couldn't work with the delicacy of artichokes if you didn't know your way around one. Most dishes that made use of it anyway involved a lot of French-inspired methods like steaming and using hollandaise sauce or premium butter and herbs. That meant that only the finest of places were serving artichokes. Even if others could have afforded it, they may not have had the expertise to know how to get the best use out of what they got. Artichokes were also more common in cities with upscale markets, and out-of-season artichokes would be almost triple the normal price, especially during the recession when price gouging was getting really common among those same markets. Have to pay the bills somehow, right? Of course, if you are going to indulge in the finer things in life with truffles, artichokes, and veal cutlets, you definitely need to have a drink of the same caliber, right? And what about celebrations, important birthdays, anniversaries, and lonely Sundays? It's not like the rich had to worry about money, so these were all valid concerns for them. Concerns which they answered with some of the finest champagne you could get in the world back then. Names like Moet and Chandon Dom Pérignon, which debuted in the 1930s, were popular bottles to see in the wine cellars of the rich and affluent. It was definitely a drink for an exclusive club, and it wasn't the only one of its kind. A lot of the cream of the crop of the upper class had rich people's hobbies, things only they had access to that others couldn't really dream of seeing. One of those was wine collecting, and when you have enough generational wealth, that hobby doesn't seem so unreasonable. Veuve Clicquot, Pommery Champagne, Piper Heidsieck, and many more brands were really choice picks for the well-off. Hotels and restaurants also still kept stocks of them just because they knew that the market for them was at least still thriving with the rich, and that part of America hadn't recessed. I know we went over how expensive lamb had become in the Depression, and that was with price cuts too, because most places found themselves having surpluses of stock. I mean, rich families ate, sure, but they were only so much of the market. The biggest customer base had no purchasing power for these things. As a result, dishes that made use of a lot of lamb became slightly more common. It was because they were serving and cooking for a smaller overall market that they could use their lamb this way. Otherwise, restaurants would probably go for more minimalist dishes. Anyway, racks of lamb were some of the most popular plates of the meat you could find. A rack of lamb was considered proper luxury eating because the rib bones were really tender, and it had quite a lot of lamb. They were priced at $1 or $2 a pound, and when you add the labor of the chefs to that, the cost only starts going up. Most preparation methods were based on French cooking, like rôti de carré d'agneau. Places in America with heavy European immigrant presences would also have a stronger demand for these because of how used to it they were, but you couldn't even find lamb in most normal butcher stores back then. You'd have to go to specialty shops the same way you'd go to them for brie cheese. I know you already caught on to this, but notice how almost everything here is imported. It really shows how much America was reliant on outside sources for fulfilling its food dreams and needs, and how importing even managed to survive back in the day and still be such a heavily active part of the economy is beyond me. I mean, wines and fruits, I can get, but they even had imported olive oil back then, man. That too from like the best places in Italy and Spain, where even if you went to markets in those countries and got it, it would still cost you a decent amount of money. A bottle of some genuine grade A high-quality imported olive oil costed around $1 a quart, which meant you were paying $10 to $20 for that amount in today's money. That's a lot for something that's heavily used in most dishes that Americans love to eat at restaurants, and actually, almost everything that I've mentioned on this list was usually cooked in olive oil. It was this kind of stuff that really sealed the deal on the entire idea of fine dining for middle-class people. If it really was just the MVP of the dish that you were paying a big cut of your check for, then it would still be somewhat justifiable at certain points of the year to splurge on good food. It wasn't just that, though. The appetizers, the main course, the prep for the main course, the skill of the high-end chefs, the costs of the ingredients, you were paying for all of it, and that just meant places that made use of things like this were completely a no-go zone for most working-class folks. Since I can't stop thinking about sweets, let's circle back to them for a bit. Applesauce bread. Applesauce bread was one of those sweet, comforting recipes that made a comeback in the Great Depression when butter, sugar, and milk were hard to come by. Applesauce was cheap, easy to make, and could substitute for many of the pricier ingredients in baking. Applesauce added moisture and sweetness to bread without needing lots of sugar, butter, or oil. Pretty much all the good stuff that people didn't have access to. You'd mix it with flour, baking soda, and whatever spices were around. Cinnamon was the best, but you had to be lucky. This was the perfect recipe to create a dense, cake-like bread that was perfect for breakfast or dessert. And let's not forget the applesauce itself. It was a hero in its own right. People made it from leftover or bruised apples that would have otherwise gone to waste. So, not only was applesauce bread thrifty, but it was also the original waste-free, eco-friendly breakfast. Plus, it could be easily customized with nuts, raisins, or anything else you had on hand to make it stretch further. In a time when dessert was a rare treat, applesauce bread brought a little sweetness into some pretty tough days. Fried oatmeal patties might not sound so glamorous, but when you were trying to make the most out of the little you had, they were a treat. This Depression-era breakfast was a clever way to use up leftover oatmeal, which was already a cheap and filling staple. Instead of just reheating plain old porridge, people would mix the cold oatmeal with a little flour or cornmeal, form it into patties, and fry it up in a pan. I don't know how I didn't think of this. It's genius. The amount of leftover oatmeal I could have saved, please don't call the Eco Patrol on me. I never know how much is too much. The result of this creative endeavor was crispy on the outside and soft on the inside patties. They could be eaten plain or topped with a little butter or syrup if you had it. And like most of these dishes, they were versatile. They could be savory or sweet, depending on your cravings and your abilities at the given moment. Fried oatmeal patties were a simple but satisfying way to stretch leftovers into another meal. And let's be honest, anything fried tends to taste better. Do I need to reference again the Kentucky Fried Chicken? I don't think so. Fried oatmeal patties were a great way to turn mushy old oatmeal into something you'll look forward to eating. Moving on to something more concrete, Johnny cakes. They could be whatever your heart desired, a main dish, a side dish, something sweet or something salty. They were true soldiers during the tough times. These cornmeal-based pancakes were a lifesaver for families looking to stretch their budgets. With just a few basic ingredients, cornmeal, water, and maybe a dash of salt if you were feeling fancy, you could whip up a batch of Johnny cakes that kept everyone fed without having to pull a bank job. Bread was often too expensive or hard to come by. Johnny cakes were the affordable alternative that could be made from cornmeal, which was widely available and cheap. These little golden cakes were versatile too. You could eat them plain, or drizzled with syrup if you were lucky to have it lying around the house. Johnny cakes were filling and could hold their own as the main course or side dish. Some people might say that they were a bit bland, but what did you expect? A gourmet meal in those times? Johnny cakes were the epitome of resourcefulness. Just cornmeal and water mixed together and fried up on a hot griddle. Simple? Yes. But when you're trying to make every penny count, Johnny cakes got the job done and kept hunger away. Mock chicken legs, a true culinary illusion of the Great Depression. When actual chicken legs were too expensive to buy, people had to get creative, crafting drumsticks out of inexpensive cuts of meat like pork or veal and shaping them to look like the real thing. These so-called legs were then breaded, fried, or baked and served up with high hopes that no one would notice the difference. And honestly, in times as hard as those, nobody even cared which meat they were having, as long as it tasted good and filled you up. The beauty of mock chicken legs is that for a split second, you would forget that it wasn't an actual chicken leg on your plate, rather something that resembled one. It was a brilliant way for families to serve something that felt like a treat without the high cost. Plus, let's give a shout out to all those women who shaped that meat to look like a drumstick. That takes a certain level of dedication. It's a testament to how far people were willing to go to make ends meet while still putting something fun on the table. Mock chicken legs became household favorites, proving that with a little creativity in the kitchen, you could really stretch that budget. When fresh veggies were hard to come by, and come on, who doesn't love peanut butter in any way, shape, or form? Coffee soup, the liquid breakfast of the hard times. Coffee soup was one of the more unconventional Depression-era breakfasts, but it made sense when you think about the times. Coffee was cheap, which might come as a shocker since it is so expensive now. It was also widely available, so when families didn't have much to eat, they turned it into a meal. The recipe was dead simple. Pour a cup of strong, hot coffee over a slice of day-old bread or crackers, and there you have it, breakfast. Sometimes sugar or milk would be added if they were available, but more often than not, it was just coffee and bread. This was a quick and easy way to stretch a little coffee into something that felt a lot more filling than it looked. Coffee soup wasn't exactly gourmet, but it gave people the energy boost they needed to start their day, and it was a comforting routine when other breakfast options were out of reach. The bitter taste of coffee combined with the soft bread created a unique flavor that grew on you after a while. I am a coffee addict as much as the next person, maybe even more, but this may be the tipping point for me. But I guess it's kind of like a tiramisu, only without the cream filling, right? Maybe I would try it. God only knows it can never be too much coffee. Moving away from the sweets, sadly, and moving towards the greens. And by greens, I literally mean grass green. When times were hard, people needed to find resourceful ways to maintain a somewhat healthy diet. And that's what they did. Forget your local Trader Joe or Whole Foods and take a peek outside of your house or apartment building. What do you see? Just grass and weeds, right? Wrong! Those aren't just grass and weeds. That is your breakfast right there. During the Great Depression, people took locally sourced to a whole new level. Those pesky weeds you hate so much? That was the breakfast of our ancestors. Families turned them into dumplings to stretch meals further, and tomato soup became the perfect partner for this duo. You'd take some day-old bread, mix it with a little milk and maybe an egg if you had one, and form it into dumplings. Then, plop those into a pot of your regular tomato soup, and you've just transformed a basic dish into something served at restaurants. The bread dumplings would soak up that rich tomato flavor, making every bite feel more flavorful. It was a genius way to avoid food waste and make the most out of what was on hand. Not to mention that tomato soup was already a favorite since it was cheap and easy to make from canned tomatoes. The bread dumplings were just a cherry on top, or dare I say, the dumpling in soup. Together, they created a hearty, satisfying meal that filled you up without costing too much. And that is a win-win in my book. While on the topic of soup, let's not forget to mention onion soup. And since it is fall and fall is the soup-making season, maybe you'll get an idea or two on what to make for your next dinner. The onion soup was proof that even the humblest ingredients could make a delicious meal. In case you didn't know, when you're working on a tight budget, onions become your best mates. They were widely available and quite cheap at the time, so they were the go-to vegetable in hard times. When you mix a few onions and some broth, even if it's just water and a bouillon cube, you'll get yourself a soup that's rich in flavor but light on your wallet. The thing that makes onion soup such a classic and timeless meal is its simplicity. Though caramelizing onions takes a bit of time and patience, they add a depth of flavor that makes you forget you're eating something as simple as soup. Once they hit that sweet golden spot, there's no coming back. With just a few ingredients, you can create something that feels gourmet, even when times are lean. But we can't forget the bread and cheese. No onion soup is complete without them. Traditionally, a slice of bread and a sprinkle of cheese are broiled on top, but even without this fancy finish, onion soup remains a delicacy of this time. What fascinates me about onion soup is that it manages to make an ingredient such as an onion the star of the show, making it into a bowl of comfort that feels like a splurge, even though it is not. Actually, just truffles. The more rare a truffle was, like the top-of-the-line imported black or white ones, and these usually came right out of Europe, the more expensive it would be per ounce. The established rate that most people were working off just to make a truffle-selling business break even or be profitable was $4 to $6 per ounce, which means it would make it around $60 to $80 per pound. That's about for people's salary for a week, man. That's a bit dystopian if you ask me. It was definitely considered a massive luxury, and only high-end fancy French and Italian places were fond of serving truffle-based dishes, but the intended effect worked. It attracted rich clientele better than anything else, as a lot of them were eager to get the precious truffles they had become so used to before imports started to slow down during the Depression. Even then, rich people had their ways. Pheasant was a wild game bird, but it was considered a rare delicacy. It wasn't the most expensive thing, at least if we're talking about rich people's money, but it was costly. A bird would usually reach $1 to $2, which meant that dishes were for $3 to $4. The real issue with pheasant was that it took a lot of work to store it properly. That meant that only specialized restaurants with top-of-the-line chefs knew how to make the best use of pheasant, and they charged accordingly for their skill and labor. That was also a part of why pheasant was something that was considered luxury dining preserved for the rich. Even if you did find an affordable pheasant at a local joint in states where it was hunted and so it was a bit more accessible, you weren't sure if you could trust the chef to make the best use of the bird. If you wanted to go and have a real pheasant dish, you'd have to step into a fancy place with chefs that were worth the money. The Depression was a bit of a weird time for wine lovers and winemakers. I mean, sure, domestic winemaking was growing firmly as a respectable industry, though it had the obvious setbacks most people were facing during the Depression. However, it wasn't able to capture the biggest market, which was the upper elite class. They were still very much hung up on their imported French delicacies, which were really considered some of the best bottles you could pop open in the entire world. Some of the most famous French wines like Chateau Lafite Rothschild, Chateau Margaux, French Bordeaux, and some other fancy categories of wine like Burgundy, among which Corton Charlemagne and Domaine de la Romanée Conti were extremely popular. Think of the market for these things as really niche and selective, but incredibly dense and active. A bottle of these would cost as much as smoked salmon or truffles, so if you ever stepped into someone's house and they had bottles like these on display, you just knew they were loaded. Not that houses like that were common during the Depression. Yet another aspect of French culture that America as a country could never do away with, even in times as harsh and frugal as the Depression, was brie cheese. This was a really special kind of cheese because it had this incredibly soft texture with a rich, creamy interior and a bloomy rind that made it top dog in the cheese world. Everyone was singing the praises of brie cheese and how it was yet another culinary goldmine discovered by the French, forever enriching the food scene globally. Imported French brie was around 30 to 50 cents per pound, and popular brands from regions known for their cheesemaking like Brie de Meaux and Brie de Melun were even more expensive. You could expect prices to go up to $1 or $2 for a pound, but if you wanted genuine, authentic brie cheese, and I mean the real stuff, absolute genuine article, then you'd have to go to novelty shops that specialize in cheese. High-end grocery stores were one thing, but they were still buying in bulk and from people that were mass-producing cheese to make a pretty penny. They didn't have the love of the game that specialty shops did. The cheese they would sell would be genuinely some of the best cheese you could find in terms of imports. We're still not done with France. It's just something you have to wrap your head around. The 20th century was dominated by our exploration of French food culture and their cuisines, both the early and late parts of it. Don't even get me started on the middle of the 20th century. Anyway, escargots were basically snails that were imported from French shores and sold for a few bucks when they touched down here. Premier French restaurants in New York would always have this as one of their finest aspects of French appetizers, and it was definitely popular with the rich crowd. It wasn't really all that good to most people because it was a bit out of touch with the kind of taste palettes and flavor profiles that were jibing with the American people back then, because a lot of people had different tastes. I don't mean that in the general different strokes for different folks kind of way. I mean that as a result of rationing for years and then foraging and living off of vegetable soups and stews, people had gotten more accustomed to things like potatoes, greens, and squirrel meat. So there wasn't much of a demand for snails to shine with the mass public anyway. Where they did get some value was in places like Le Pavillon and La Côte Basque in New York, which would only cater to the elite, and were known as being strong footholds of French cooking in America. During the Great Depression, things like clams casino were considered a part of what was known as haute cuisine and high-end dining because of their rarity and price. A lot of fancy eating back then was actually just for status, and the heavy pricing of most of these dishes is what attracted a lot of the kind of gentry that would frequent high-end restaurants in the first place. Clams casino was a clam-based dish that was first made in the early 1900s at the casino at Narragansett Pier, which is located in Rhode Island. Ever since its inception, it's only continued to go upwards in terms of price, which kind of speaks to the name it made for itself. The dish involves very five-star quality strips of bacon. A lot different from your usual diner dish, that's for sure. Top it off with seasoned breadcrumbs and shellfish, and you have a pretty tasty dish around baked clams. Not the most popular thing to make the centerpiece of a recipe, but this definitely accomplished everything it tried to do flavor-wise. It was smoky, savory, and just appetizing enough to work great as an entree. Staying on the theme of no waste or zero waste, whatever you prefer to call it, we've got ourselves split pea soup with ham. When money was tight and meat was a luxury, even the humble ham bone found new life as the star of this hearty dish. Toss it into a pot of split peas, and you've got yourself a soup that could feed the whole family for days. The magic of the soup wasn't in the peas, but in the leftover ham bone, which gave the soup that smoky, rich flavor you could ask for without actually needing any meat. That right there is kitchen creativity at its finest, bringing out every bit of goodness out of something that might have otherwise been thrown away. As the peas simmer and break down, the ham bone starts working its magic and releases all the flavors into the broth. If you were one of the lucky ones, you would catch a few small bits of meat still clinging to it. But never mind if you didn't, the bone still did its job. Corned beef and potato hash was a true Depression-era hero. It was affordable and filling. In a time when fresh meat was hard to come by, corned beef in a can was a lifesaver. Corned beef and potato hash was a shelf-stable, cheap, and stretchy meal. It was a dish that kept bellies full without keeping the wallets empty. The beauty of corned beef hash was in its simplicity. Fry up some chopped potatoes, toss in that canned corned beef, and let it all get crispy in the pan. Adding an onion or two added a bit of spice, but not everyone had that option available. But even if you couldn't afford onions, the combination of corned beef and potatoes was just enough. It was a meal that tasted like you put way more work in than you actually did. It was the kind of meal that could stretch to feed the whole family and still leave enough for leftovers the next day. Corned beef and potato hash wasn't just a Depression-era staple. It was proof that you didn't need fresh ingredients or fancy cooking techniques to make a hearty, filling, and tasty dish on a budget. When times were tough, nothing went to waste, especially not bread. Instead of tossing out stale loaves, moving on to something less fun: egg and potato hash. Egg and potato hash was the ultimate Depression-era breakfast because it was cheap, filling, and easy to throw together. Potatoes, one of the most budget-friendly foods around, were diced and fried until crispy, then mixed with scrambled eggs. If you were lucky, you might throw in a little onion or whatever leftovers were kicking around. Bits of ham, maybe even a stray vegetable. The beauty of this dish was that you could stretch it as far as you needed. Not enough eggs? No problem, just add more potatoes. The fried potatoes added that crispy texture, while the eggs brought in some much-needed protein to keep you going through the day. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was warm and hearty, plus it kept everyone fed and happy. Egg and potato hash was the kind of meal that stuck to your ribs and could easily turn a couple of basic items into a satisfying breakfast that made you feel like you weren't missing out, even during tough times. I wish these were the sweet kind of muffins, but unfortunately they're not. We are going to get to know one of the breakfast staples of the Great Depression era: carrot muffins. Some might say that this was a sweet way to sneak some veggies to the table. With butter and sugar in short supply, people used the natural sweetness of carrots to help flavor their muffins, creating a sweet and moist breakfast without breaking the bank. Now, I get that carrots have a sweet taste to them, but I wouldn't call this meal sweet unless someone added some sugar to it. Not much, Just a little would be enough. These muffins were also super versatile. If you had some cinnamon or nutmeg, you could spice them up. Or if you had some raisins or nuts, you could throw them in too for some extra flavor. They were an affordable, filling option that got people through hard times and got some vegetables into kids' mouths and bellies. Not a total parenting waste, don't you think? Just kidding, it was an epic parenting victory. Any veggies that somehow get into kids' hands is a win-win situation. As I mentioned before, eggs were hard to come by in those times, and it showed. Food didn't contain enough protein, and it was hard to maintain energy levels throughout the day. Beans and rice, a dynamic duo that has been filling up bellies for generations. In lean times, this combination was a nutritional powerhouse with protein, carbs, and plenty of flavor, all without costing much. When money was tight, beans and rice were the way to go. They were cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed a whole family with just a few basic ingredients. Another great thing about this meal is its versatility. Got any spices lying around? Throw them in. A sad, lonely veggie waiting to be declared garbage? Throw it in too. It is the meal that will adapt to whatever you had in the house, not the other way around. It always manages to come out tasting like you put more effort into it than you did. Plus, let's be real. When you've got a pot of beans simmering away and some rice cooking on the side, it smells like home, which is what people at the time desperately needed to be reminded of. The beauty of bean and rice is that it is not just a survival meal, it is a comfort food packed with nutrition. While we're on the topic of rice, my personal favorite, rice pudding. A sweet reminder that nothing should go to waste, especially not leftover rice. In the era of the Great Depression, where every rice grain was counted, families found a way to turn yesterday's leftover dinner into today's sweet dessert. Rice pudding became the ultimate budget-friendly treat, transforming something simple into something comforting and sweet with just a little sugar, milk, and a dash of cinnamon if you were feeling particularly fancy. I know leftover rice seems kind of blah, but once it simmers into something that looks and smells like pudding, you'll forget what you were even talking about. Plus, it was an easy way to turn ingredients you had into something new, which saved you money and a trip to the store. It felt like a real treat even in lean times, and that's why it was so popular among families. A warm bowl of rice pudding could brighten up the end of any meal, turning frugality into a moment of indulgence. So even though it started as a way to cut food waste, it stayed a family favorite that warmed up even the coldest hearts in those freezing times. These meals made your stomach come up through your nose. Give us a like and subscribe. Don't forget to tell us in the comments which of these dishes were your favorite or least favorite.